Thanks everyone for joining us today. With how many times we have done this, I don't think we need very formal introductions, not to the panelists, not also to the subject of net zero. Thanks to everybody who has spoken about it since the last couple of months, but definitely the way net zero became such a wide-ranging issue and the fact that there is effort that has to percolate more broadly. As climate trends, we try and bring together this conversation at some points in the year where we think that we need some of the experts to get their heads around on what's the progress that is happening on what's termed as a long-term strategy. What is India's climate geopolitics at the moment, especially at a time when in the global situation, the energy crunch has precipitated due to many reasons, Russia cutting off gas supplies to Europe, posing big challenge with the winter period about to set in, and just the negative effects on the economy, the rolling food crisis, energy crisis situation, as well as a lot of extreme weather events that have happened this year, which indeed were not something which were surprising. If you look at the IPCC studies, they indeed point out runaway climate change will set in, and a lot of emphasis has come this year already on climate impacts and the extreme weather events that have happened. We will definitely talk about them in due course. Thanks, Ritu, for joining. I see that you're now online. We've just begun. But that's what we mostly wanted to discuss in the next 1 hour or so. What is it that is happening in terms of India's progress on long-term strategy? The COP is round the corner. That's a COP in Egypt this time. Either it's being pegged as the Africa COP or it's being pegged as a Middle East COP. In either scenario, it feels like the landing ground for some of the issues which got started last time. For example, the recognition of loss and damage and the need for countries to come together to agree to a concept on how to finance loss and damage induced by climate is another topic that we wanted to pick up here on this session a little bit. Similarly, there have been a lot of feelers in the press that we are reading about the launch of a carbon market in India, how that will be game changing, how that will lead to reduced emissions. And there will be more to discuss as well on the role of carbon markets in bringing emissions down. There is also something to be said on what actions are being taken, perhaps in terms of states. When we speak to a lot of state governments, it feels like that is where the action is, and that's where the action has to be. I think it's the general agreement that center can drive only so much action, and in the federal structure, states have to play an important role. I'm only saying all of this in the context of how we feel that we would like to have some of your comments and observations, and then definitely India already submitted its updated NDCs. A lot of it speaks about the emission intensity targets, and the installed renewable capacity does not have any change in number on the afforestation/carbon sink goal, which was existing in the update in the previous NDC. So some views on how do you think about the NDC now? Do you think this is ambitious? And how do you think about power sector decarbonization, which really is a big chunk of the NDCs? And the bigger question on India's position on climate geopolitics, its agenda for this COP, its role as well in internationally oriented, innovative areas like loss and damage financing. We will come to it one by one, but I just wanted to say a few of these things to set a little bit of a context on what we'd like to hear from all our panelists. As you all know, all of these sessions have journalists attending who will quote what you will say. I will only request all the journalists who are filing the story to please check back with panelists before you quote them in a news story. But without further ado, I'll request you, Navroz, to please set the context on what do you think at the moment is India's climate action interest? What if you know is the progress as well on long-term strategy?
Dr. Devise, you're on mute.
Yeah, yes, got it. Thank you. Thank you very much, Aarti. Thank you, Gunjan, for organizing it. And look forward to hearing all our esteemed fellow panelists, Mr. Rashmi, Dr. Ritu Mathur, and Vaibhav Chaturvedi, and others. So I'll try and be brief, and I think we all like to have this be as conversational as possible. I think the really interesting thing about this COP is whether or not, given the fact that it's in Africa, given the fact that we have had these weather events, really serious disruptions in South Asia, in Europe, in the US, whether we get a head of steam behind the political agenda of some sort of serious consideration of both adaptation financing and an adaptation mechanism, as well as loss and damage and sort of the compensation story. The Secretary General just recently sort of made a call for some sort of distributive tax on fossil fuel companies. I remember when more than a decade ago there used to be a lot of discussion about a currency transaction tax, which is a good way of converting, generating some money from the global system. Those kinds of conversations may well come back. As well as conversations directly about direct payments for compensation. So I think that if there was ever a moment to be serious about the finance for to ameliorate impacts agenda, I think this is it. Related to that is the finance story around just transition. So everybody was very excited with the South Africa conversation last time around, where South Africa quite nimbly, I have to say, put together this sort of consortium of funders and said, look, we're going to be serious about financing South Africa's just transition. India has been in conversations, Indonesia has been in conversations. That has also lost some momentum. My understanding is that the South Africa story has not moved as fast as expected. Indonesia has not got as much interest as expected. So I think on that side of the story also, there will be a really, this will be kind of a litmus test of whether or not these conversations will result in anything serious or not. The context for all of this, of course, is going to be the Russia-Ukraine war, and the fact that it has driven up global gas prices enormously. Europe is sort of sitting, in a sense, stuck between going backwards to coal and accelerating forwards to renewables and plugging the gap with gas as fast as they can. All kinds of strange conversations about whether or not Africa should develop its gas for export to Europe, whether or not Africa should in fact be funded to develop its gas, or whether it should be compensated for not taking advantage of that. These are the broader conversations that really complicate the COP discussion. By the time the COP rolls around, we will be in the middle of the European winter, highest sort of energy demand, and so the politics of this is going to be very, very, very fraught. So in a sense, you see a ramping up of the pressure for finance, and you see a tightening of the conditions under which finance can flow. So that's not a good, it all suggests that there's going to be a lot more pressure, and I really wonder how that's going to play out. Just turning very briefly to the G20, and then I'll talk about India a little bit more directly. So India will be taking the reins of the G20 at this very important moment. I think all conversations about climate are going to be inflected by Ukraine, and India is being put in a position of, I think we've quite carefully walked a line. Most recently, the statement by the PM at the summit with Xi Jinping and Putin and the Mongolian premier, where we've sort of not, we've been careful to say, look, we're not very excited about the fact that there's a war going on. At the same time, we have not condemned Russia like the West has been demanding, and we've of course been, using access to Russian energy. So I think there's place here for India to take forward an agenda on energy transition in the G20 that says, look, in what ways can the West really help India, African countries, countries that are developing, increase our energy use in ways that are the least carbon intensive possible? That will really be the question, and avoid us becoming more dependent on gas in the way that they have. I think there's also scope to take forward the life agenda that the PM has been talking about in the context of building infrastructure that is supportive of sustainable lifestyles. So I think there's interesting things that one can do here with the G20 agenda. And I'm again, it'll be the big cloud hanging over will be Ukraine. Finally, in domestic conversation in India, I think it'll really, others will talk about the NDC. I can come back to that. My brief line on the NDC is that it's a bit of a mop-up operation in that it clarifies things that were left hanging. And I think to that extent, it's positive. I think that actually our NDC is kind of is not aiming to stretch the boundaries at the international level, but what we're doing domestically goes much further actually than what we're saying in the NDC. So we're probably in an over-compliance logic between the NDC and the global pronouncements. And sorry, between domestic policy and the NDC as a global pronouncement. I think our credibility would be helped a lot by releasing an an LTS. And I think, as many of us know, there has been work ongoing in the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change with other ministries in producing this LTS. Many of us have been part of those conversations. CPR certainly has been. And I think the idea that we will be looking, what I hope it ultimately comes out and says is, starts a conversation about how in various sectors India can start transitioning to a low carbon development future. So not just low carbon, but low carbon development that also brings other development gains, whether it's energy security, whether it's, and probably first and foremost, job creation, but also with attention to local environmental harms. So that sort of formulation is, I think would be very useful. And I'll say one last thing, Aarti, and then I'll stop. I think this is the moment, you talked about net zero as the overarching context for many of these conversations. In a weird sort of way, given all the short-term pressures I've talked about, rising gas prices, the Ukraine war, et cetera, people looking for money for just transitions, people looking for compensation in the short run, the net zero 2050, 2070 conversation doesn't actually give you a whole lot of guidance on that. What actually gives you guidance is thinking through, for a country like India, how are we going to manage our energy needs for development in ways that minimize our lock-in to a high carbon future? Because if we do lock into a higher carbon future, it'll be more costly later to unwind that. But I think that the argument should be that India's energy needs will grow, which means in the short run, emissions almost certainly will grow. Is the short run 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Not so clear. But for some period, India's emissions will grow. And no cries of net zero are going to change that. I've been a bit worried by studies that have been done by overseas, suggesting that India can plateau its emissions in the next year or two. I don't think that's feasible. I think our energy needs are just too high. And in the short run, that means carbon needs. So I think we have a chance to frame our narrative, but we should be focusing the spotlight on the next decade or two and say, this is what India is committed to, a low carbon future, but a low carbon future that allows us to develop and meet our energy needs. So that's I think the framing challenge that we will take to COP. And we have to do it in a way that enhances rather than undermines our credibility as G20 chairs. So it's a narrative building exercise that is going to be very important, and the LTS could really help with that. Thanks, Aarti. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Navroz. I'll just pick up a few of the things that you said, and maybe we can bring other views from Ritu, Mr. Rashmi Weber as well on this. I mean, the fact that you said the NDC is a mop-up, and so I'm just thinking there is no requirement as well for enhanced climate ambition at this time when the rest of the world is doing what they're doing, just in terms of a low bar, G7, Europe
Well,
being in a tough spot.
sorry to cut in, Aarti, but just to clarify, the NDC is enhanced ambition from our last NDC, from what we said at Paris. So it's, I was talking, it's a bit of a cleanup with reference to the Glasgow Panchamrit statement, but that was not officially an NDC. Right? This is actually an update of the Paris NDC, and it is an enhancement compared to that.
Yes, and I think the spirit in which I made my comment was essentially that the renewables target in the previous NDC was about 40%. This one is 50%. And criticism also says that we will anyway achieve this. So it's not really enhanced ambition in that regard, but that's just one view. And, we don't need to really discuss on that. Take your points on how you said the decisions on long-term strategy are really about the next decade or so, and really just not about emissions to come down. And I felt that in the NDCs, even the no absolute target reflects that spirit, that there is no commitment to hold back to absolute emission reductions at this stage, and it should not be. Before we move further, Rashmi sir, would you like to comment a little bit on, in your view, what does this mean? Because the last COP at Glasgow ended in a very dramatic situation with all the narrative on coal phase down versus coal phase out, and the world is in a different situation exactly 6 months after, but we are doing what we are doing. So how do you analyze India's climate trajectory at the moment, especially in terms of international narrative building? I will come to the question on carbon markets a little later, if that's okay.
Yeah, so thank you, Aarti. Thank you very much. I hope I am clearly audible. No, thank you. Yes, the important issue in COP27, which is going to emerge, is not the further enhancement of NDCs. I mean, that is my own sense, that a lot has been done as far as the NDC updates are concerned. A large number of countries have done this. So in a technical sense, what COP26 expected them to do by COP27 is already in motion. And India has also updated its NDCs. And just to add to what you said in the initial remarks about how the forestry carbon stock target will be considered, in fact, the update is not about elimination of any of the existing targets. Update is about enhancing the existing targets. So if you so the forestry carbon stock is very much a part of the NDC. All elements which were indicated in the initial NDC exist there. Only those areas which have been updated, and there are 4 of them. The emissions intensity target, the electricity capacity target in terms of renewables, the lifestyle for environment, that is an addition. The target was already there in terms of sustainable development. It has been clarified. So these are essentially a clarification and an enhancement. All the others exist. So the issue which I think is going to take the center stage in COP27 is not mitigation anymore. Mitigation certainly has played its role in the global discourse, but with the global supply chains currently under disruption, and this is going to hit everyone equally, and perhaps with a varying degree of intensity of all countries. I think the appetite for further intense discourse on mitigation, I think will not be there. Will be much lesser. So, and I think rightly so, because we should be focusing on 2030 rather than net zero in the long run. Net zero is, of course, a part of the discourse now, but net zero has to be seen in the nature of strategic and sectoral decarbonization policies, which are a part of the long-term strategy. And India is also moving in that direction. So in real sense, the enhancement which will come about in India's own efforts will be through an LTS and not through enhancement of the NDC anymore. NDCs will actually depend on the further enhancement in the NDC should, I think, technically await the further outcome of the global stocktake, which is just about a year away. So the relative performance of various countries in respect of their NDCs is going to be reviewed in about a year or two, whatever time it takes. So further enhancements logically should depend on that. Now, whether India is positively placed there or not, it's a matter of assessment. Domestic assessment says that we are moving positively, but Navroz mentioned in his remarks the challenge which is emerging from other quarters of overseas assessments which are being done. They're not looking at the relative contribution of the countries. They're looking at absolute emission reduction as the goal towards net zero, as the final global goal. And now, absolute emissions reduction is certainly not on the horizon as far as India is concerned. I was looking at one of the assessments in this regard, and they were saying that by 2030, India should reduce its absolute emissions by almost half. That is, that is an argument which I think seems preposterous, because then we don't want the dialogue to begin at all. So given that kind of discourse which is emerging, we need to be very cautious about what we should talk about net zero. And certainly the way to counter this would be to come up with a credible and effective long-term strategy for sectoral decarbonization and things like that. So that was as far as the mitigation part is concerned. Given this scenario, I think logically and rightly, the focus of COP27 should be on adaptation and will be on adaptation, and more so because it's is being held in Africa. Its adaptation is very dear to Africa. It has always taken the lead in highlighting adaptation issues. But what kind of outcomes can we really expect from this is difficult and hard to judge. As you can see, despite the fact that Egypt is the presidency, going to be the next president, the loss and damage is not on the agenda. While adaptation will be taken only to the extent of formulating a global adaptation goal. In Glasgow, they said that the adaptation finance will be enhanced, but they have not even agreed on a long-term finance goal. So how will this all be done? We are not clear about financing needs, the assessments, the instruments of finance are not very clear. So given this, at best, which this COP can achieve is to formulate a clear strategy or clear indicators for global adaptation goals. And there are ways of doing this. In my own view, we were having a discussion the other day with some of the experts on this. It's not simply about finance. It's also about the kind of strategy which we want to implement. For example, an early warning signal in each country to predict the kind of threats which are emerging in different sectors. That also is an equally important element of the strategy. And then this is what is happening in India. You can see that the climatic, the disasters, the intensity of the disasters in India has gone down over, at least the impacts have been addressed more effectively because of the ability to predict the disasters. So this ability to predict the adaptation challenges, disasters is a very important element of the strategy. I think global goals should take this into account. Again, the goal should be looking at some of the way in which we manage the resources. For example, our land, our water, and then globally. We have a global goal, for example, about land degradation neutrality. Why can't it become a part of our adaptation discourse? Similarly, management, the water efficiency, this can become a part of the discourse of the adaptation goals. So what I was suggesting is that our adaptation discussions should become a little more comprehensive, should not remain only finance-centric. They should look at the strategic issues as well. I'll come to the issues of the carbon markets, I think maybe in the second round, but I think limit myself to these issues at this stage. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. I mean, you talked about adaptation goals, and it just feels that in media, a lot of narrative is being played out, not just on adaptation goals, but also on one step ahead, that is talking about the context of loss and damage, how it's different from adaptation. And last year we saw in Glasgow, there was this call for setting up a new mechanism for financing loss and damage. Now, all kinds of permutations are coming up on where such a financing mechanism could sit, who will pay for it. In very rough, crude terms, as I understand, loss and damage finance will be different from adaptation finance because the damage has already happened and somebody pays for it. And the moment you agree to do this, you enter into a whole host of legal issues which nobody wants to touch, especially the developed countries, and it becomes far more contentious to actually commit yourself to a third type of finance, which is not adaptation and not mitigation. And given we are so far away from whatever should have been done, I see Ulka has joined. Ulka, I know you have also just joined late and didn't hear comments from Navroz, at least. That was a roundup. But can I ask you to talk a little bit about what, in your view, do you think about a loss and damage financing facility? Can it become a real thing? The Secretary General yesterday gave very strong statements on how this is the time to step up. He talked about PR companies who are doing PR for the fossil fuel producers. Can't go any stronger than this in terms of global rhetoric, and can't go any worse than this in terms of extreme weather events, Pakistan floods, etc. But just your views on, is a loss and damage funding mechanism a reality? Will something happen? What is the politics of it? What is India's stand on this? Any nice things to report or no?
Thanks, Aarti, and very sorry for joining late. I had promised to
No
join
problem.
the Vasudha Foundation and GHG Platform India, who are launching their updated estimates of India's greenhouse gas emissions. No, on loss and damage, may I say that the Pakistan floods are really on top of everyone's minds in the climate negotiations. Two points of an argument for loss and damage finance gets built from the situation of the Pakistan floods. One, that private sector commercial insurance completely breaks down in the case of this kind of disaster of this magnitude. In the past, people have talked about setting up climate disaster, insurance mechanisms with a layer of public finance, but it's something of this magnitude, it completely breaks down. And the second is that for countries like these, other countries in the Caribbean and Latin America, a disaster of this magnitude makes them fall deeper into climate debt. Now, where will the additional money for loss and damage come from? The COP26 Glasgow discussions had happened before the Ukraine war broke out. So now it seems that, if at that time they said that don't expect $100 billion at least per year until 2023, now to talk about additional loss and damage finance seems even beyond people's, sort of what they're willing to discuss. However, there's been a very nice op-ed by Rachel Kite recently talking about innovative new sources of finance. For example, she talks about putting a windfall tax on fossil fuel companies. She talks about a fee on voluntary carbon market transactions for buyers, a tax on business class air travel, and debt for climate swaps. And as you would know, the IMF and others have been talking about debt for climate swaps for a while now. So there are some additional sources of raising finance, even in this situation where the Ukraine war seems to be looming large over everybody in Europe or the US. You're absolutely right, Aarti, that more than the finance, it's that scepter of being held legally liable that stops countries, developed countries, and the negotiations from talking about loss and damage formally. PG&E in California, the electricity utility, is said to have been the first climate change bankruptcy. And right now, if we acknowledge loss and damage, there's nothing to stop, say, a child growing up, 10 years from now in any country around the world, saying that certain countries or certain companies are legally responsible for the loss of their quality of life or their home or their future. So certainly this is something that looms large over these discussions. But since you asked me to talk about some positive things, some nice things, let me mention a few developments that have happened. Just yesterday, I think Denmark announced that they would be giving another $13 million specifically for loss and damage finance. Vanuatu, in its NDC update, has actually said what it will do on loss and damage, what are the measures, and how much they will cost. So, for example, they have said they want to build climate resilient infrastructure. They want to augment their healthcare. They want to relocate vulnerable communities. And this will cost $178 million by 2030, which needs to come from donors. So it's a very important first step, because often donors say, but what exactly will you fund? What exactly is loss and damage going to support, and how much do you need? In the United Nations General Assembly that's happening this week, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights has been, in fact, over the last few months, been inviting comments from people. And there is, in fact, in their report, a special chapter on loss and damage. So this is something which, in addition to COP, is already on the radar in the UNGA discussions. However, going forward, what we need very specifically are three things. One is to operationalize the Santiago network on loss and damage, which was created. There is a coalition of vulnerable countries and think tanks called ACT 2025. I'll put the link in the chat box. And they have proposed a kind of institutional structure with a secretariat, with experts and all that. So that is one proposal, but this SNLD needs to be operationalized and the institutional structure set up. Second, this should become, loss and damage should become a formal agenda item, a permanent agenda item in the COP negotiations, specifically in the subsidiary bodies, the SPI or SPSTA, their negotiations. Only then will it get this kind of formal recognition, so that every time we don't have to fight for it to be brought in. And the third is the actual setup of the funding and the flow of the funding to the developing countries, to the projects where loss and damage actions need to be implemented. And the example over here is that the Climate Vulnerable Forum countries and the V20 countries, the Vulnerable 20 countries, set up a joint multi-donor trust fund with a dedicated window for loss and damage. So if somebody wants to donate money, they should know where to put that money and how it will then flow. The Bangladesh Climate Change Trust Fund, which was set up, I think, maybe about 10, 15 years ago, is a very good example of how countries can also put in their own domestic resources in addition to international climate resources and implement these actions in partnership with long-standing local NGOs, community-based NGOs, who know what is the action that is required. And finally, there is, the BCCT, is going to have a 2-year pilot national mechanism on loss and damage. So that will be something to watch, and perhaps for other countries to see if they can borrow some elements of that. So let me pause there now, Aarti. Thank you.
I have one direct question just for my clarification. The Vanuatu plan you said, is that, did they not put an updated NDC and all? Like what?
This is part of their NDC update. So they have decided to highlight or shine a spotlight on loss and damage in their updated NDC, and actually put a number there, a bill for it. Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit more about debt for climate swaps? This conversation comes up a lot, just for the benefit of those who are attending. And the third point is, before many years before, there was discussion on bunker fuels and taxing those bunker fuels. People are bringing those discussions back. There were some discussions also about taxing airlines. Navroz, when he spoke about taxing, like there is a call for taxing fossil fuel companies. So when we are really looking for when we are really in a space when there is no money in the pocket, then are these kind of taxes and levies on bunker fuels, airline travel going to give some kind of critical mass with which to proceed? Because public finance is really dry and little. So just wanted to ask this directly before going on to others. But,
sure, let me just separate out.
Others can address.
Sure, let me just separate out these 2 points. On the climate, debt for climate swaps, Basically, the origin of this was when countries like Fiji and other countries in the Caribbean were hit very hard during the COVID lockdown during 2020 by a number of cyclones. So their economies were already in recession because of the lockdown, plus they were hit hard by these cyclones, and they had to repay the climate change adaptation funding that had come to them from developed countries in the form of loans rather than in the form of grants. So this is the kind of the falseness of international climate finance when it is in the form of money that needs to be repaid by a country that is suffering from both economic recession as well as natural disasters. And that's when IMF created this new window. They called it a Solidarity or Resilience Fund. And I'd be happy to share links over here. But there is room to do much more. There have been talks about a climate and health swap as well. So basically, you could swap out one form of funding for another. You could also bring in the IMF special drawing rights as an additional form of currency or cash into the system. The second point that you made about taxing. So people are just looking for different opportunities for raising additional finance without putting a burden on ordinary people, on end consumers, without having a regressive effect. So for example, 2 years ago, you would recall there was, or a year ago, there was discussion of a minimum corporate tax worldwide, 15%. What would that money be used for? Could it be directed towards adaptation or loss and damage, the kinds of actions that don't attract commercial funding the way mitigation and renewable energy does? So these are the different types of things. But as you can imagine, what it requires is political will, both within the country, because say, for example, for United States or Europe, but also internationally, because as long as there are tax havens, these various entities will find another way or another territory in which to register so that they can evade these taxes. So it will require international coordination on these policies. Thanks.
Thanks, Ulka. I think let's keep going. I also see Sandeep is here. Thanks, Sandeep. You're traveling or on the move, but I hope you can hear us. We'll come to you in a short while. Vaibhav, so much discussion on India is going to launch a carbon trading system. Some details were shared, still a lot of fogginess around how the market will be set up, what are the features of the market, what will it mean, just in terms of granular details. But other than that, of course, it will be projected as a big thing and reportedly will address a lot of the corporate or industry emissions in if I can put it very simply. Can you parse this a little bit? Can you help us understand what the blueprint means? What is our plan on carbon trading? How will it be introduced and what will it lead to?
Sure. Thank you, Aarti and Gunjan, first of all, for inviting me, and very good afternoon to all the panelists and all the colleagues on the call. And before I come to carbon markets, I'll probably just give a general comment on the NDC thing. With Aarti, you mentioned that 50% could be an obvious thing, like we anyways achieve that in the BAU itself. And I think, the macroeconomic headwinds that the world is seeing and that India is seeing, it's very important for us to understand the implications of those or the potential implications of those. And in fact, even before the Ukraine war, we were very clear that the inflationary situation is going to come in a big way because of so much money that was pumped into the economies, especially the rich world, because of the pandemic. So anyways, we knew that in some way, some impact on growth will happen, but the Ukraine war has obviously made it much worse because now energy price shock has also started coming into the global macroeconomic setup, right? So what does it mean? So it has got two important implications. One is, of course, the larger debate on climate finance. That, well, anyways, when the macroeconomies around the world are going to be hit, well, climate finance on all of the different aspects, be it mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, it's a bleaker scenario from that perspective, clearly for the next decade. The second interesting implications is about, India's electricity generation capacity and the renewable addition, possibility of renewable addition. So in terms of, let's say if there is a high growth that happens, that was expected to happen pre-Ukraine war and the pandemic, then the amount of capacity, electricity capacity that could be absorbed, like new renewable capacity additions and all that, there's a much higher room for that, just because growth is happening and the demand is there, right? But of course, when growth tanks down, then there's a lesser room available for even new capacity additions. And what our analysis shows that if the economic growth is 7.9% versus 5.9% in the decade, let's say 2020 to 2030 decade, so 2 percentage point drop because of the global growth impacts, the new capacity addition could be hit by almost 40%. And that's a very big number. So essentially, we might have touched, let's say, whatever 800 gigawatts by 2030. Now we will end up being maybe 650 gigawatt in terms of demands. So now that's a very big hit that is coming because expected to come because of global macroeconomic headwinds. And that has implications for this 50% target or the absolute amount of renewable that is going to be added into the grid. So we should be cognizant of this now very new scenario emerging and its implications for the NDC. So in that perspective, NDC is definitely now more ambitious. If the 50% target was announced 2 years back, maybe we would have said, well, BAU, we'll achieve that in BAU. Now it definitely appears much more ambitious in new context. Now coming to the carbon pricing debate, I think it's a very big announcement because of some factors. First thing is that officially now we have recognized carbon pricing as a key kind of policy lever, which was not there. So there's a lot of debate in even the Indian civil society whether we should go for carbon pricing or we should do sectoral policies and all that. Now clearly carbon pricing has been recognized now that it is going to be one of the levers. Even the instrument for pricing carbon, there is not just about carbon pricing. Even the instrument for pricing carbon, it could have been a carbon tax, it could have been an ETS. Now it is also very clear. It is going to be an emission trading scheme kind of instrument or system. Those two things, that great clarity has been brought through these announcements on this particular aspect. Now coming to the Indian market, and we have had this, we have been discussing with Indian industry folks. We also had a roundtable discussion just a couple of weeks back on that, on the carbon markets thing. Very interesting things are emerging. First of all, the understanding within Indian kind of setup, be it industrial guys or any stakeholders, generally speaking, we talk about, the understanding of carbon market comes from a very project-based perspective, because that is what our experience has been. So there is almost zero experience of thinking about an EU ETS kind of system, but there is a great experience or information or knowledge about the project-based system, because the CDM that came through the UNFCCC process, that is also project-based, and the voluntary market that many corporates have a great experience of dealing with, that is also project-based. So even when people were asking questions, the questions were like, what methodologies are going to be approved in India's ETS? What technologies are going to approve? Now these questions are very relevant for a project-based setup. They have got nothing to do with your EU ETS kind of setup. So it's a very different formulation altogether. The stage at which India's kind of larger industrial ecosystem is at, they have near to zero experience of even understanding what an EU ETS setup means, generally speaking. So that is the case. So that's a big information gap. And I think our effort, and generally the effort of many think tanks, should be even to educate them, so to speak, that, well, the new system that could come in India 10, 15 years from now in its kind of mature form will not be a project-based mechanism kind of thing, right? So that is one thing I just want to emphasize, because that's something very important. Now, in terms of what the white paper of Bureau of Energy Efficiency says, it talks about 3 different phases, and details are emerging. I would simply say that this was just the first white paper for having these discussions. Details are still emerging, and I think it is being the whole thing about fungibility of credits has been given a big importance. So there are so many e-certs in the Indian market. So many companies are sitting on unsold e-certs. Many of them are sitting on unsold REC, like renewable energy certificates, right? And also many of them are sitting on unsold CDM credits, right? So a big motivation in the initial phase has been, how is there a way we could convert these into carbon credits so that they get some demand, so they're sold. So people who have invested in these kinds of things and sitting on these credits or for these credits, how can these be sold into the market? Now this would be very different from the third phase. So it says first and second and third phase, the white paper Bureau of Energy Efficiency on carbon market. The third phase, it says, is going towards a full-fledged carbon credit trading, right? Now that third phase is very different, and right now we are just trying to better understand how do we link the first and the second phase to the third phase, because the third phase is going to be a very different animal. Of course, it will take some time, but that's where a lot of effort is ongoing to create those natural linkages or natural transition from the first, second, and the third phase. Now, in terms of ETS, just wanted to say that let's say EU ETS. In EU ETS covers around 45% of European Union's total emissions. 45%. So that's the coverage. Whereas in Korea, it covers around 73% of total emissions. Right. So there's a big range. And why there's big range? Because it depends on what is the structure of the economy, how many big industries versus small industries, right? So what will be India's number will be determined by many of these things. What sectors you want to cover, big industries, small industries, and all that. You can't cover small industries in a ETS system just because the monitoring cost is very high. You can't monitor, 1 million MSMEs if they start operating under an EU ETS system, because monitoring with verification of emissions, carbon credits, allowances, the transaction cost could be very high, right? So again, whatever be the number, the larger point I want to make is there will be always complementary policy. So irrespective of the ecosystem in which ETS operates, let's say EU ETS 45% or Korea ETS, which is 73%, there are always complementary sectoral policies, especially things like, let's say, transportation sector, like EV charging infrastructure. Now that is not going to be guided under an emission trading scheme, EU ETS setup. EU ETS is like for large polluters or this kind of emission trading system that eventually India would have in all probability. It's going to cover from emissions from large industry, because that is going to be a big part. Power sector, industrial sector, right? That will probably account for, 75% of our emissions. If you talk about if you remove a small industry, still it could cover easily 50-55% of India's emissions, right? So, but other 40% or 50%, it is going to be governed by many other complementary sectoral policies. And what those policies would be, that time will determine those kinds of policies. The final point I want to make is, what is the indicator of success for a carbon market? It's very important for us to understand the indicator of success for a carbon market. So many times, you would have read the debate that the price of allowances fell in the European carbon market. It's close to zero. The market is failing. A lot of debate happens in those lines also. What experts at least tell us, that price is never a metric for success of an emission trading market. Right? Emission trading market is a regulated market, and the measure of success is it able to reduce emissions to the extent that the regulator wants. For example, if India says our emissions should be in these sectors should be limited to X, and ETS is an instrument for limiting emissions till this level, then irrespective of the price of the market, it doesn't matter. What matters is we should be able to limit emissions to a particular level, as whatever our country kind of decides, and the largest civil society and industry together decide, right? So something like that is very important, that price is not going to be price is of course an important variable in the operation of the market. It's not the critical variable as far as the success of the market is considered. So having that point of view is also very important, that we should not focus too much on the price, but focus on the high level emission trajectory that the ETS is going to be able to deliver for us. So let me just stop here. I'll be happy to answer more questions about this ETS. Thank you.
I wonder if there are more questions from the audience, but this carbon market system is really complicated. I think I will paraphrase, and please help me understand. The voluntary system, which is happening right now, will bring no real gains in the world, neither in terms of carbon reduction nor in terms of any revenue. Something that will happen in the future, which is cap and trade, which will be set up when sectoral policies will also happen. There is a well-oiled system. There is standardization. There is good carbon pricing. There is incentive for industry to lower carbon emissions, which will happen maybe 10 years down. That is the point in time when some public revenue can be generated out from it, and it can be a successful system. Till then, for the moment, from India's point of view as well, it's just setting something and taking the initial steps for it. Yes. And some real stuff will happen at some point in the future.
Yeah, well, let me say any real stuff. For example, EU ETS, I think it started in 2004. But the full-fledged or mature market where many things were in place was around 2014-15. So any market, it always takes 8, 10, 12 years to reach that maturity phase, because in the initial phases you want market participants to be comfortable with even the operations of the market. So you don't want to introduce heavy penalties in the first 5-7 years just because people are understanding how the market operates. Now that's one thing. Eventually, what could happen, and I think in all probability what will happen, is we will have a UN driven market, which is still going to be project based. Let's call it CDM 2.0, whatever we call it. But basically CDM 2.0, ITMOs we are calling it right now, will be there with the project based market driven by UN, right? There will be then the India's domestic ETS market, which is also a regulated market, but it's not a project based market, right? But India, like EU ETS kind of system, completely domestically driven in India, right? It's nothing related to the directly UN in terms of approvals and all that, completely determined by the government of India. And the third market will be a voluntary market, right? So there is already a voluntary market which is already existing, which is very where these companies who want to demonstrate a higher degree of climate action already kind of buying credits from that market. So that market, so eventually these three very different kinds of animals will coexist together. And I think the big confusion currently is because this EU ETS kind of system has no experience in the Indian setup. We have great experience in voluntary and well as UN CDM market, but the draft of Bureau of Energy Efficiency introduces the term voluntary. It says voluntary market. So now there is some confusion that there is already an existing voluntary market, but this is now a regulated voluntary market, right? So the terminologies and the phrases that have been used, I think there is definitely an improve for clarification on many of those, because people are now confused that, okay, voluntary market we're already buying. Now this is a government of India voluntary market. What does it mean? Are they connected? Are they different? What happens to the existing voluntary market? Will it be shut down? So I think there is definitely, so you are right, it is a very technical subject, and it will kind of require repeated kind of dialogues and many of those kinds of information sharing processes where participants hopefully will understand that they will have to be in a situation dealing with all these three kinds of markets in one setup, and then they can choose which one they want to participate. Do they want to participate in multiple of them or one of them? Within Indian ETS, they will not have a choice, because the government of India will say that, steel sector, cement sector, power sector, large industries, you are going to be governed by Indian ETS. So they will not have a choice, but they will have a choice of operating in the UN CDM 2.0 and the voluntary market. They will have a choice whether I want to create a project through these different sort of, channels, so to speak. With the government of India setup, they will not have a choice. It's going to be a regulated market, right? But as I said, I mean, it is confusing, no doubt about it. For people who are just understanding these many different carbon credits is the term used for all of these markets, right? Even though the nature of the market is very different, we use the same term of carbon credit. So of course, I mean, the hope is that with time, all of us will understand many of the angles around carbon credits more and more. And of course, that's our effort also, is to explain many of these things to all the colleagues here. Yeah.
Thanks, Vaibhav. I think net zero always had two elements. No, last year the whole world was excited about zero. Now suddenly, when people are figuring out what the net means, then all the problems are coming out of the closet. But one step at a time. I also have to still take inputs from Dr. Ritu Mathur, Manish, and Mr. Sandeep Asokar. And we are already 1 hour, but quickly, maybe Ritu, if I can please invite you. You are also on secondment to Niti Aayog. There must be lots of hectic discussions on what is happening in terms of India's long-term strategy. What are the various initiatives that states are doing? What are the sectoral initiatives that you think are exciting to put forth at this moment, given whatever discussion has happened? Maybe you take the floor for some time and talk about the progress as you see in your view.
Yeah, so thank you, Arti. And so just to first of all say that, whatever I'm discussing is more in my personal capacity and should not be taken as the view of the organization. But yes, I think, as we are seeing more and more movement towards COP27, I think what the status is and how we stand is definitely seeing more discussion. But I think where we are positioned today, and I want to come back to, from an India perspective, where Navroz pointed out, the kind of narrative also to be set at this point in time. I think with the geopolitics panning out at this moment, and the changes that we are seeing, going forward from the COVID times, the need to, again, position ourselves clearly as India, I think, is emerging stronger and stronger. And that's where I'm hoping the LTS would also position itself in terms of, definitely putting the development perspective up front in terms of, moving towards a just transition as we move towards a clean energy pathway, as we move towards the net zero goals. And I think that is where the discussions really need to sort of paint the narrative very clearly from an India context. When you talk about, the sectoral and the state level, that definitely is, again, something which is becoming more and more centric to the whole discussion. Whether you look at it in terms of what technologies, how to bring about the finance, how to talk about, bringing in more concessional loans to and the concessional finance, what forms of finance to have, blended finance, or what kind of green bonds to bring in. When you're looking at the transitions in the industry sector, for example, some of the hard to abate sectors, you need to center stage all of these discussions in very clearly. Also, when you start looking at the action needing to happen in moving towards the low carbon pathways while trying to maintain our need for growing energy, the infrastructure that we will require along the way. And clearly, again, Navroz had also commented on our need to grow. Our energy requirements are going to increase, and therefore, it places India in a unique position of having to, take on this challenge. But I think, again, as a country, we are seeing this as an opportunity to do this and, look at changing our development perspective in a way that we don't, number one, lock ourselves into infrastructures that, that do not stay in, that do not remain viable in the long-term future. But at the same time, preparing ourselves as an economy, as a society, which is resilient to be able to undertake this clean energy transition. So I think that is where the focus, at a domestic front needs to be, and clearly, again, policies that are being put in place are, I think, strongly in sync with that requirement. I think the green hydrogen mission, which has been put forward, the discussions on, the life perspective, the life initiative. I think there are several angles through which I think the initiatives are seemingly more holistic to me, in the sense of not only looking at the hard to abate sectors on one hand, but at the same time being very mindful of where the social pressures, where the economic pressures might lie, and trying to have action on all fronts at the same time. Also, when you talked about the state level initiatives, I think, again, that is where much of the action is going to be, and therefore being able to look at having the action plans at the state level tie in with what is required at the national level, be it through our NDCs or in terms of the overall strategy for the country. I think that is becoming increasingly important. So the need to think about, how to involve the states is definitely going to increase. And there again, I think the government is focusing its efforts more and more. So I think in terms of where I see, discussions needing to be focused also within the upcoming COP, while much of the focus thus far has remained more on the mitigation side. Clearly, we talked about it earlier on. I think the focus needs to start also focusing more and more on the adaptation, loss and damage side as well. But I think also talking about the brass tacks on how to enhance the amount of finance across all of the dimensions needs to continue remaining an agenda, and I hope there would be some strengthening on that front as well. from a domestic perspective, from the national perspective, I would say, the policies that we are putting in place are holding us on good ground. And again, reiterate what Weber also mentioned. While the policies are there, we should by no means think that the targets are meager or minor. I think India has taken on very ambitious updated NDC targets. And with the current situation where we stand, these are not BAU. You could go one way or the other in terms of what kinds of energy requirements we may have in the future, what choices are able to pan out, and how quickly we are able to ramp up the levels of clean energy into the overall mix as well. All of these multiple aspects, I think, play a role in determining how much we are able to achieve. So clearly, it's not something that can be sort of touted as being very easy to meet, and we have to take action on all kinds of fronts to ensure that we meet our NDCs and more. I think the real change where I sort of look at in terms of envisaging the transition is in terms of looking at a larger vision of a medium to long term strategy, and within that, planning for the shorter terms. So the context of 2030, but within the context of a 2050 or beyond, is becoming more and more important in being able to ensure that all kinds of stakeholders, whether they are consumers, whether they are the manufacturers, the businesses, etc., are able to see clear guidelines, get clear guidance in terms of where we are likely to proceed, and get the correct kind of signals to also be able to plan what kind of options people are able to take on in the move towards a low carbon development path as we move ahead. So I think the dimensions are clearly multiple on which we will need to move, and I think both government policy as well as action from all of the stakeholders will need to play a role in making this a successful move.
Thanks, Ritu. I think there was lots in there, but took your point that let's not consider that what we have is BAU. We certainly have put in enough given the global situation, but yet we need improvements both from a domestic perspective as well as the international perspective, especially when it comes to things like finance. And maybe Sandeep, if you can hear us, because you're looking at the renewable sector from a very different lens. You also will be able to assess, for instance, in terms of the access to capital and how it continues to be a challenge. I want to ask you, because solar is one place where we put a lot of our bets on in terms of decarbonizing our economy, and then there is still now problems in accessing full funding for solar, as I understand, just roughly speaking, not to say that money is not coming, but the access to capital is a challenge. What do you think are the avenues for us when we are looking at decarbonizing our energy systems now and in the future? And what are the kinds of funds or institutions, or roughly what kind of green finance ideas are there which are not being tapped enough right now and present some kind of an opportunity in the near term?
Yeah, hi, Aarti. Am I audible?
Yes, please
Okay,
go on.
I may drop off because I'm actually traveling, so please bear with me.
But thanks for joining in while you're on the road. Thank you. Please go
Yeah,
on.
no, it was quite an interesting subject, and I've been kind of tracking this for a fairly significant length of time. Yeah, it's an interesting time also that you chose to have this conference, because given what's happening on geopolitics. I mean, as it is, while the dance had started in Glasgow and everybody was tentatively sizing up as to whether there was any, monetary commitment involved. I think as it stands now, all bets are off. There's a fairly dramatic change. So all, maybe Bretton Woods institutions, the entire geopolitical scenario, the entire financing scenario is undergoing dramatic change. Coming to your specific question, what it would take for decarbonization, having gone through one cycle, having been part of the JNSSM cycle and what decisions in terms of policy as well as implementation were taken at that time, I think in some ways we got the wrong end of the stick. Instead of focusing on the commercialization part of it, we kind of focused more in terms of creating a regulatory structure or incentive structure, which ultimately didn't work out terribly well. We neither built the manufacturing capacities, rollouts, very complex mechanisms which didn't work, RECs, carbon credits. It was fairly quite a pig's breakfast which ended up. I mean, I've seen it in terms of the context of comparatives with regard to so for any technology to be commercial, I mean, if you see through it at it historically, including fossil fuel technology, it requires enormous amounts of money, cheap financing, which essentially make the technology extremely widespread and bring it to common usage. That has not really happened as we had expected it would with solar and some of the other renewables. Yes, we've done well, but we could have done significantly better. So to answer, the short answer to your question would be, we need to make large quantums of cheap funding available to solar, which would essentially require economies of scale. Unfortunately, in JNSSF, we went the other way, where we essentially began with making it a cottage industry. So that was a bit of a challenge. So yes, I mean, from my point of view, the route to go is identify sectoral and national champions, and along the lines of either the Kairitsu or the Chai balls, give them whatever support is required to build out the sector. That's my perspective on the entire thing.
Sorry, when you say,
Yeah,
large quantum of cheap funding has to be made available, what kind of money will come and from where? Will it be international public finance? Will it be equity investment that will happen? It will be some green bonds that will be raised. Can you please break this a little bit more for us?
Yeah, so the money would come in. The money would come in primarily where it sees essentially a productivity advantage. So, for example, green hydrogen, we are able to establish it, and we are able to establish sectoral advantage. I mean, it's a fairly simple point that private equity essentially sees returns. Private equity sees dominance in markets. I mean, a comparative example, for example, could be Huawei. Huawei in technology, essentially when China opened up, they had a clause which said saying that you have to manufacture in China and you have to partner with the Chinese. So they started out partnering the Europeans and the Americans, and then ultimately ended up decimating them. And Huawei, eventually became the largest telecom manufacturer. Of course, subsequent fallouts and geopolitics and all those aspects are a later point, but that's what it takes to essentially build industry dominance. So my point is, if you build industry dominance, and India is a large nation of 1.3 billion people, and clearly there is money coming into the country. The question is if it can come into Zomato and into Byju's, and it can come into the Swiggies. Why is it that it doesn't come into manufacturing cutting edge technology? So my personal view is that the focus should be more in terms of how do we get, or rather how do we naturally guide. There are large pools of quantum still available, even though liquidity is tightening globally. There are large pools of quantum which are chasing returns, which are seeking returns. And India has a very bright spot in the entire global economy. The question is, what can the government do in terms of nudging these flows, which naturally flow towards returns, and just channelize these towards some of these emerging sectors where you still have a chance now to dominate. Solar, we missed the bus. If we miss the bus in green hydrogen and the others, I mean, I think we'll have nobody else to blame but us. So that money will flow naturally where it sees returns. You know, we've done the RECs, we've done the carbon credits. I've had projects which have defaulted on loans because my RECs were not sold, carbon credits, you know. So this entire exercise of, you know, building architectures which are, you know, intellectually very attractive, but which do not work on the ground. I think we need to leave that behind. In my understanding or in my experience, the only two people who understand this, politicians and businessmen. I think it's best left to politicians and businessmen to take those risks, make a few large bets and go the whole hog. If you are looking to build sectoral champions which have, you know, world dominating kind of skills. The rest is, I mean, okay, I mean, we do keep pushing papers here and there, but I don't think it would lead to any outcomes. I mean, at least they haven't led to any outcomes so far. So that's my personal view.
Okay, your personal view
Yeah,
is thanks. I was just saying your personal view is quite revolutionary in that sense. What you're saying is regulations and regulatory mechanisms don't work. Just make it open, channelized towards politicians, corporate sector who can really make it happen. I think I take that point on. There is money that is available if startups and service industry focused initiatives can get all the funding, then why is it that solar is lacking? And also when the government has put so much emphasis on ramping up solar, recognizing the capacity of solar to be quite a significant part in power sector decarbonization. Maybe, you know, things that you said mostly with respect to channelizing more money there is a separate and a discussion in and of itself. But thanks very much, Sandeep. I think those were nice views. Certainly not the typical views, but nice nonetheless. You know, you spoke about the power sector anyway, and Manish, from what I understand, you've done some first of its kind study where you have modeled on an hourly basis till 2050, if I get correctly, just the power sector transition that will happen in the Indian states. And what you say is that if India does solar, then by 2050, electricity cost can be almost halved. Can you explain this? I mean, a lot of these opportunity narratives come around all the time, and that reminds me of actually Navroz's op-ed, which basically said these opportunity narratives are quite prevalent, but we should really focus on, if I understand correctly, just really focus on developing the economy in a low carbon way rather than just saying X number of new jobs, X amount of costs saved, etc. And, you know, it kind of makes sense, but your study and the research that you have done is also new, it's promising. And every time states are looking at moving away from coal, it's always that question on how much saving it will bring. Can you explain a little bit of what you have done? And if I can just add one more question to it, globally, if you see, the confidence on gas is really high. I saw a survey which FT had done, which basically said that huge confidence increase in terms of investor confidence only. I'm not talking about anybody, like not the general public, only how investors have perceived. And it was two waves, between one before Ukraine war just started, so one in January this year and one in August this year. Both the waves, quite surprisingly, you know, investors in Asia continue to believe that renewables will be important, and they also continue to believe that gas will be important. So they're not, you don't see renewables and gas as replacement. They just see as renewables and gas as a conjoint energy strategy of the future. Sorry, I don't mean to make the question very long, but please explain your study, address some of the concerns with respect to gas.
Yeah, thanks, Aarti, and also Gunjan for organizing this, and sort of good afternoon to all the panelists. Well, I think we've been basically looking at different energy systems around the world, and also India has been quite the focus. And we've also worked with some people and sort of tried to understand how the Indian energy system sort of operates. So one of the first steps was to look at the power sector initially, and then move to the other sectors. We've done it for some parts of the country, and then I'll also talk to you a bit about the importance of the other sectors. So initially, I mean, like we've been looking at trying to do pure cost estimations, like cost optimizations, and it's basically an exercise in trying to see how the energy system or the power system will sort of pan out if with the different cost structures. And with most of the cost assumptions that we've done, even in a bit of a conservative scenario, we see that renewables naturally sort of take over. And the power system is purely built on a renewable base. And within the whole sort of price merit, you can say that solar obviously emerges as the key technology, given that India has fantastic resources for solar, and also it is pretty much well spread across the country. And it's also, the costs have been sort of coming down drastically, and it sort of undercuts every other technology that way. So purely talking about from a technology perspective and what the outlook for solar is. So I think the interesting things that we sort of found when we were doing the study is that when we understood how the Indian power system was shaped up and how the transition is happening, so we saw that there are only 7 or 8 states in the country that has all the renewable capacity addition and is contributing to almost 90% of the generation. So the eastern and the northern states and the northeastern states are sort of completely left out. So when with the northern grid, it's only Rajasthan, and then most of the other states have very less capacity. So that sort of prompted us to then look at trying to model India from a very state-specific perspective. So mostly the CA or most of the other long-term studies, they basically look at India as one node, and then they sort of do the analysis for sort of the whole of the country. So here we thought we'd sort of break down the country into the state level and the different regional grids. And so we broke it down into the different grids and then sort of did the analysis to see how the energy system would sort of shape in. So there we saw that there is a lot more sort of benefits for the Indian power system to develop with a more sort of expansive planning. So not look at only concentrating all the renewables in certain states and then investing a lot more on transmission networks and then the grid network to again take it to all the other parts of the country. So if you sort of have a more decentralized planning and try to sort of match the demand and resource availability, that can help a lot. So in one way, I think the arguments obviously to have an LTS, because a lot of people say that there's no value. I think an LTS sort of helps you understand these different aspects of how to sort of shape the entire transition. Which cannot be seen sometimes. And then obviously we also see there's a lot of requirement for storage. So storage again emerges as a key technology pocket where it's very much needed, not just for the power sector, but again for the other sectors will start sort of developing. But even for a power sector transition, we definitely need quite a lot of storage. And again, an LTS sort of can then sort of give insights about where the storage hubs can happen. So it can be more strategically sort of placed in the different states and develop different states according to the demand. And storage can then become, sort of pockets of industries within themselves for certain states. And then that can sort of help in also ensuring that we have a more cost optimized power system, but also then a more distributed sort of a power network around the country. So some of these findings then led to the fact that we have the potential to reduce per unit electricity costs by almost 40-50% by 2050. And we see that the sort of, when you do your cost optimization, the transition sort of ramping up is a lot more. And we see that some of the most ambitious scenarios are sort of saying that by 2040, we can already do at least the power sector quite clearly move it to completely renewables. And then now coming to the second question on the whole gas thing, I think there's obviously been a bit of a sort of a market dynamics, right? So the gas prices have gone up, and then now investors are seeing that there's value in certain pockets where they can invest, where then it was previously not even viable. So I think this whole situation with Europe, and now everybody knows that the German minister has been going around hunting for gas everywhere and then sort of ramping up a market for gas. But I think at least when we spoke to a lot of the utilities in India and just before the Ukraine war, so most of the gas power plants in India are still operating at very low plant load hours. So it's like the existing capacities are not being used at all. So it becomes kind of difficult to understand where this sort of market for gas would come from. I think at least from a point of view that there's this lot of buzz around green hydrogen. This obviously sort of fits in more with the kind of energy system planning that is happening pretty much everywhere, and this is where we see a lot of value addition too. At least the chemical industries, even like Reliance has a very aggressive plan for the next 10 years. It's their 2030, 2035 plan. If you see, they're like ramping up hydrogen production massively, and they're looking at how they can replace the entire sort of value chain, convert it to more green chemicals. So I think there's going to be a lot of demand from that perspective. So the industry seems to be already trying to read the sort of market indicators and the trends and trying to set themselves up to sort of gain from this. So a lot of the gas infrastructure then can switch over to hydrogen. And definitely then green hydrogen has a more role to sort of replace natural gas. And with India being reliant on imports, I don't see how a gas market would take off here unless it is then complemented by hydrogen. And that could be one of the factors or the underlying sort of things that is helping out.
Thanks, Manish. I think there is a lot of rubbing together in the media reports on how we will do gas today, hydrogen, and the same infrastructure can be used. And the hydrogen policy perhaps is a different discussion. I know we are also close to 90 minutes. Maybe we will do just a last remarks by everybody. I don't want to paraphrase a lot of what has been said, but because we also want to look at it from some kind of a narrative lens towards the COP, we will hold maybe 1 or 2 future sessions as well before a lot of people actually go to Sharm el-Sheikh and do the negotiations. But from what has emerged from a lot of what all of you have said, I just want to recap on 2 things. One, it just feels that finance is the point where more and more mistrust comes into the negotiations process. This being an Africa COP, the West being in a very tight spot, it just feels that that mistrust could increase this year if no discussions of either a long-term goal are done, or nothing on just transition finance happens, or not even a new loss and damage finance facility comes. So I'm just wondering if you have to give your last remarks for this session, just in terms of what can be the opportunities for finance, if anything, at this negotiation process. Then can we just go around the room, and whoever can feel free to come in first, and we can just have everyone's views and wrap up. Navroz? You're just next on my screen, that's why.
Why don't we see if Mr. Rashi wants to go first with that?
Sure.
Thank you. You have put me in a spot. No, I do see a lot of discussion taking place around the issue of finance in Sharm el-Sheikh, but I'll be very frank with you, I don't really see the final outcome there. It's still a process, and I think unless the global stocktake is firmly in place, the parties are not likely to move. I'm sorry to be sounding a little be pessimistic, but the nature of the discussions around finance has been such that it is extremely controversial. And now with the entire the process, this talk about climate club being emerging in different sections of the global leadership, the expectation is that everybody should contribute. Now, that is not exactly the way in which the climate discourse takes place within the UNFCCC. And so that is my real worry. This entire thing will get hijacked on a different track. And the real issue of mobilizing finance and moving the international capital to the developing countries on the terms which can really incentivize the investors or help the investors in moving the capital to greener sections of economy is not going to happen. So long-term goal of finance will still remain a process. The $100 billion, again, is an open question because they have admitted that they have not been able to progress much. So it will remain an open question. Of course, there will be a lot of discussion on this. I'll just conclude by touching upon the issue of the carbon markets, since you had referred to this. The essential question as far as India is concerned, we should be trying to, we should first get a hang on this question, whether we are going to look at the carbon markets as a means of emissions reduction or as a means of incentivizing financial flows for a low emission development. If we are clear on the objective of the carbon market, then I think the design will also become clearer. It seems that we are being moved by the narrative which is emerging in the global context, and the way the carbon market has been experimented across the world in different developed countries. That template is not really going to work. What will really work is the model that we have followed in the past under the Kyoto Protocol, where CDM was essentially about emissions reduction transfers along with a promise of finance. So here, this is the kind of design which we should be looking at, not in terms of a cap on the emissions, but in terms of incentivizing the green projects with the help of carbon markets. I don't think we have time to go into details here, but I think that is the basic point which I wanted to make.
Thanks very much, sir. Just carrying forward in the spirit of finance being controversial and no money being available, I just want everybody's views as well. And I also wanted to add, given a lot of focus on what was called the JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, is there any pool that can be used for energy transition, especially when we know that we are not even close to the kind of money that we need every year?
Is it a question for me?
No, sir, you're free to answer, but I just wanted to go around the room as well. Vaibhav, Ulka, Ritu, Navroz.
Well, I don't mind coming in on that. So I think ultimately, I think what we're going to start seeing is the multilateral and bilateral funds being diverted increasingly to this. It's already a big agenda for the multilateral agencies. I think the risk is, of course, that this money will end up going to the big countries, and you won't actually see that much money going. If it's mitigation focused money for JTP, it'll end up being concentrated. But I want to come back to the carbon market because I didn't really talk about that as well. If I could, Aarti, and pick up on what Mr. Rashmi was saying. It's funny, the kind of the attention the carbon market kind of idea gets is a little bit out of proportion to the amount of detail and space devoted to it in the Energy Conservation Act amendment, really. It doesn't really give a great deal of detail. Everybody is focusing on the background paper or the whatever it is, the transition plan paper. All it says is that BE will play a big role, and there will be such a thing as creating carbon credits, right? There's a very, very, very long way from there to actually having a carbon market. And other people have spoken and written on this about the pitfalls of partial markets, of what it means for small business, and so on and so forth. So the way I read this is maybe slightly different from Vaibhav. I see the carbon market, there is now, it's part of the mix in a way that it wasn't earlier. Will it be, and it probably will be, a lever? Will it be the dominant lever? I don't know. Will it be the main lever in place of a carbon tax? I'm not even sure about that, because actually a carbon tax is much simpler to implement and has other advantages. A carbon tax is easier to design to work with other sectoral regulatory policies. Because a tax will basically just sit on top of sectoral regulatory policies. A carbon market, if the price is low, will do much less than sectoral regulatory policies. It won't be the binding constraint on companies, to get a bit technical about it. So I think that we've opened the conversation. Do we know which way it's headed? I really don't think so. I'm not even sure if B as an entity is necessarily the best entity to be the regulator for this carbon market. There are all kinds of issues around how the revenues from this carbon market will be shared between center and states. So sort of federalism issues around financing. I mean, the huge numbers of questions really. So and then if you're talking about a low carbon transition, lots of the upfront investment decisions, in a sense, won't actually be shaped, may actually fall out of this net of the carbon market. In other words, a lot of the key decisions about an emerging economy that is growing rapidly, those where you put your money may not actually be shaped by the carbon market, but be shaped by other things, including sort of government investment decisions and so on. So it's an interesting conversation that's opened up. In my view, perhaps we could have done with a little bit more thinking before going down this path to see how all this fits together, and how one sequences these things. So my bet would be really that the upfront sequencing will be more focused on other levers in the short run. In the meantime, a carbon market will be steadily developing in the background, and perhaps start playing a bigger role a little bit later down the road. But this is pure speculation.
Thanks, Navroz. I mean, clearly this is a lengthy discussion, which we are happy to pick up the second time we do a session. But what you're basically saying is that before we commit ourselves to a big carbon market space, there is considerations to be made. This is not going to be a big solution in terms of emission reductions, and a lot more is possible in terms of alternatives. Quickly, just on finance.
Emission limitations as opposed to reductions.
Limitations. Okay, right. We did not cover, other aspects of net, but we would like to cover in future. A lot of people also talk of carbon dioxide reduction technologies. What kind of portfolio of investment, portfolio of technologies would definitely come in? Maybe, in a couple of months, we can invite all of you again to have some discussion, because that seems like the buzzword now suddenly as well. But back to whoever wants to say a few things on the touchy issue of finance, the expectations at this COP, and if anything will happen. What will happen? So, something will happen. Ulka?
Sure, Aarti. I was just seeing that there are 45 days to go to COP. And if you look at the recent buzz on social media or the news, it has all been about the Queen's funeral and about a lot of African voices speaking out about colonialism. There's a direct parallel to what is happening in the climate change context as well, because a lot of African countries have been talking about how they are expected to leapfrog over the gas-based transition, go directly to renewable energy. A lot of several African countries already have something like 90% of their electricity coming from RE. But the scale of their electricity capacity is something like 1% of what is India's requirement. So there are limited kind of connections between or relevance for India. But many of you might have seen the news item in Mint recently about how India is entering into an agreement with African countries on lithium access in exchange for debt relief. So there might be different kinds of deals, some in cash, some in kind, but certainly driven by different countries' national interests. On JETP, or the Just Energy Transition Partnership, I don't know the details, but to me, the how is as important as the how much. If you look at the scale of India's coal mining sector and the scale of South Africa's coal mining sector, we are 10 times that. The need or the challenge is 10 times that of South Africa's. So does that mean that if South Africa gets $8.5 billion, we'll get $80 billion? I don't think that's very likely. But to me, what's more important is how. What can we learn from how the South African Presidential Climate Commission worked over a decade and something which culminated eventually or took the form eventually of this JETP partnership, and how they evolved this social compact with communities, with industry, with unions. Can we try to bring in some of those elements? On loss and damage finance, I think India's role should be really that of expressing solidarity. I think the statement from the Environment Minister, the last COP was also that, expressing solidarity with the least developed, most vulnerable countries and letting them get priority in terms of any kind of L&D finance that comes. But to me, I mean, this is a little bit off topic, but one of the very interesting pieces of information that I came across in this US Inflation Reduction Act was a rebate that is being given to electric vehicles. So consumers get $7,500 back on the electric vehicles that they purchase, but provided that the car has been manufactured or assembled in North America, and provided the battery minerals have been mined or recycled in North America. So my sort of takeaway from this is that what happens outside the COP will be as important or more important than what happens in the COP in terms of finance, in terms of industry transformations, and in terms of political actions. Thanks.
Thanks, Ulka. Indeed, the outside game is a different one. And we saw in the Glasgow COP, it was largely outside game, a lot of new initiatives, efforts, etc., which are organized, including methane reduction, electrification of transport, etc. I can see Tanya Thomas has twice asked the question. Curious to know if you expect any sector-specific regulations by a certain date. And Sandeep, you had a hand. Please go make your short comment. But are you there, Sandeep? There is a specific question that Ramesh of Hindu Business Line has from you on.
Hello.
Yeah. Yes. Go on, Sandeep.
Hello. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, try again. Please go on.
Hello. Hello.
Sandeep,
Okay, we can hear you, but looks like you cannot hear us. Maybe try in 1 minute. Until then,
Yeah, if you can come in, Aarti. So on this particular question on sectoral regulation, on the sectoral regulation question, I think, we already have a regulation related to the power sector, right? So even the NDC talks about power sector, targets for power sector. So in some way, though, for some sectors which are maybe better placed, regulation is already there. The question is, will we have something for, let's say, the transport sector, right? Like 30% of sales in 2030 have to be like electric vehicle sales, something like that. So that is, I think, the moment we are, as a larger society, more confident about that costs are falling down, there is actually rapid investment happening in infrastructure, the technology is matured. Whenever those things will start happening the way it has happened to the power sector, especially the solar story, we will be much more confident with specific sectoral regulations. And there is no need for us to kind of think about specific sectoral regulations as of now. The overall emission intensity target is already there for the economy. And same for emission trading market. Whenever large industries and power sector will be a part of it, of course, it might be, for the next 10, 12 years, it will only be probably the pilot phase we are understanding. So the real regulation will start kicking maybe post 2035 or 2040 or so. When, let's say, India's emissions are expected to peak and when we have to start actually reducing, to move towards net zero. So it will take some time. Right now, I think we are just building up the system, the operational experience, not just of regulators, but also of the different market participants. That process will be on. So that is about, I think, a carbon market. So it will be a specific regulation for certain sectors, whichever fall within the carbon markets, right? So that will be there. Now, finally, on the climate finance thing, on the CDM aspect that Mr. Ashmi said, I think the context of CDM 2.0 is going to be very different. So when CDM, this first thing came in, then there were targets on the developed world, right? Under Kyoto, and there was nothing on the developing world. Right? So we could very well sell credits, we could earn money, and they could, under the corresponding adjustments, they could use these carbon credits for their own accounting, right? That's how it worked. In this I think the biggest confusion, and if we know that Mr. R.K. Singh also announced, right, that there will be no export of carbon credits from India, right? There was a reason for that announcement because the things are very unclear as of now. And the accounting part of it, the corresponding adjustment part of it, is one of the biggest debatable things. But conceptually, it appears to be very simple that if a company pays for a carbon credit thing, then a company also owns the accounting rights for it, right? Like it's a country pays for it, it should have the accounting right. But that is where the confusion is. If India now has got this emission intensity target, and what if other companies from other countries start buying credits from our market, right? And then start using the accounting of the mitigation happens in these countries as against happening in India, right? So basically, we won't, even if we physically achieve that 40%, 45% emission intensity reduction, in terms of the accounting purposes, we have not achieved that reduction. And that is a big confusion, right? It might not be the biggest number, but that's a big confusion. So unless those sort of confusion are really clarified, CDM 2.0, let's say how it picks up, ultimately the domestic ETS is not going to be a source of climate finance. It's going to be a lever for domestic mitigation. And UN system will be in parallel, be there for the finance part of it once we are able to get over a lot of this, especially the accounting related confusions which exist as of now.
Okay, as ever, very important but really complicated. I'll just leave this here now. What you said, I think, has been picked up. Ritu, I think you can have the final word, and then we will wrap up.
Not the final word, but nonetheless, just to follow up on Vaibhav's point, I think in terms of sectoral issue, I would say maybe it's too early to come into sectoral targets. And while we may be talking more about what can happen in the power sector, and we are pushing more there also because the country is more endowed in terms of renewables, I think there's a big difference when we are talking about the cost of energy at the delivered end. In terms of the 3 cents or the 5 cents we talk about per unit right now, but in terms of being able to scale up the grid and be able to handle the intermittency issue, it becomes a completely different story, which is then definitely not staying at the costs we are talking about at the generation end. So given the uncertainties, whether it's RE or whether it's any of the other technologies which would have in the transport sector or the hard to abate industry sector, I think it's fairly early to talk about sectoral targets. But at the same time, I would say that when we look at the longer term visions, the strategy, it's also important that we sort of align ourselves to some goals in terms of moving forward in some of these big ticket areas. Like REs, hydrogen, etc., which are fairly clear in terms of the directions we want to go ahead, and then sort of have sectoral way forwards, if I may call them, rather than targets which are binding. Because I think, again, we will need multiplicity of things to happen, and the national target will have to be met by action in terms of each of the sectors, and no one sector can really clearly give us the level that we want to achieve. So yeah, that's what I wanted to come in with.
Final word, Navroz. Final.
Sorry, didn't mean to rebut in, but just to complement what Ritu said, I think it's also about, when we think about sector regulations, we have to stop thinking in terms of regulations that are only about emissions, right? These will be about low carbon development trajectories for the sector. So these may be things that are directed towards job creation, energy security, other development objectives at the same time as they move us towards a low development society. So it's actually a more complex task, and there's limited learning from. I mean, of course, there's some, but it's not 100% translation. Which is another reason why I find that the carbon market per se, which is a carbon regulatory measure, may not give us everything that we need if we want to do low carbon development as distinct to emissions reduction. Those are two related but slightly different objectives.
Noted. Thanks, Navroz. I think we are also coming close to the hour. I will really not try and paraphrase. A lot of what you all said is out there. If it's the time for finance, this is it. As you started talking about it, Navroz, I think lots in the mix in terms of domestically what needs to happen, where money should come, where the opportunities lie. There are some possibilities, not all is bleak, but on the international climate finance scenario, it really looks like we are in tricky waters. We don't want another shifting of goalpost. We will see how the COP will find common landing grounds with the way the presidency is negotiating certain things on issues like adaptation, loss and damage, finance. It already looks like it's going to be a tough territory in Egypt just for the purposes of the COP, but otherwise took everybody's views on how the targets themselves are not very mean considering the global situation, but also considering the fact that we don't need sectoral emission reductions or definition of them at this stage. We can go and define them in the future. And if we lock ourselves into something as big as carbon markets, it can also be thrashed out a little bit more between experts to see what we have is really something that will give us the results that we are looking for. Thanks very much once again, everyone, for joining in these discussions, which can get pretty wonky sometimes. We try and keep them simple. Thanks to everyone, all our colleagues who took out time to be on the panel. Possibly we will do one session before the COP starts in Egypt, and we'll be in touch with you. Thanks and have a good day.
Thank you, Aarti.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
sir.
Thank you, Aarti.
Bye-bye.